I'd like to invite Bishop Dwayne Royster and Bill McKibben to join me up here, and we're going to do something that activists and spiritual leaders often have to do, which is stand up on their hind legs and talk for a long time, because we discovered that if you sit down, no one can see you after the first row. But you know, the first question that I want to ask everybody all the time is, where are you arriving from? What are you feeling in this moment? What is arising for you in this moment, in this country? And I'm going to give this to you so that you can be heard. But I bet you can be heard without it.
Well, first, I just want to thank the Shalom Center, Rabbi Waskow, Arlene, and all of those that are involved. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and share with you, be with you, and honoring me tonight. I honor you for the legacy of work that you've been doing around this country and around the world for a very long time. So, Rabbi, thank you so much, and thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause for Shalom Center. So, and I do want to thank Reverend Greg Holston for that great introduction. You honor me and you bless me, my brother, and Reverend Nicholas O'Rourke. Thank you for the song selection, and Sister Rourke for being here with us today. We bless you and thank God for you, and all of you that have gathered here, the Penningtons and Reverend Frank and Pennington from Living Water Church and colleague in ministry. I'm arriving at a place in this moment in time. I was telling with folk at the table earlier tonight that I'm arriving at a place where I realize political victories will be few and far between in this moment. And I am at a place where I am believing that this is the moment for the community of faith to come together, snatch back the narrative and the vision of this country, to correct it so that our land is healed, our people are healed, and everyone can thrive. I'm here in a moment, and you know, it's funny, we were talking at the table, and I left Power and left Philadelphia, left my congregation to go to DC to become the political director for the PICO National Network. It's the nation's largest faith-based organizing movement. We have 45 organizations, 22 states, 1,500 congregations, 1.5 million families around the country that are organizing, not just saying it, but actually putting their feet to the ground, getting arrested, having protests and actions, and doing things that are really powerful and positive, speaking truth to power, being a prophetic voice in this nation. And, you know, as I was sitting there thinking and wrestling with all that's going on, I was going down to Washington because I thought we were going to have a little bit of a different turnout in the November election. And we had this massive agenda that we were going to get done when things happened in November. And when January 20th came around, we were like, oh, we're going to go work and we're going to get all this stuff done. And then everything totally opposite of what we desired happened. And it's in this moment where we're stunned and we can't believe what we just experienced in our nation. We can't believe what people in our nation actually believe. That it just became apparent to me that it was time for faith folk. Some progressive, others just people of faith, to stand up and to once again be the prophets that would dare to walk in the halls of power, to speak truth, and to call for justice for all of God's children, to call for justice for all of God's creation. Because in this moment, everything is at risk. In this moment, everything is at risk. So I'm glad to be around folk like y'all. That together, we're stronger. Together, we're more powerful than the forces that oppose us. Together, we're more powerful than all the evil that's present in empire right now. And that together, we can change the world.
Well, first of all, many thanks. I've sort of made it a point in recent years to when people say, "Oh, I'd like to give you an award or something," to say, "No, there's too many other people who doing this. And one of the things about the kind of climate movement that we've built is it's very big and very broad and doesn't require leaders. It's sort of spread out, decentralized, the way we want our power system to be, someday, and things. So but Art insisted, and so and at a certain point, there's no saying no, and so the way around it was to understand for me that this is a way actually of honoring his work and the work that he and all his colleagues, Phyllis and everybody else, have done over these many years. So thank you for that work. And he always shows up. I mean, whenever there is a fight, whenever there's there he is. And that's, showing up is an awfully large part of all of this work. I'll answer your question literally, where am I arriving from? And I'll do it as a sort of way of apologizing for the fact that I'm largely incoherent. I've been on the road for many weeks, a week in your city, in Washington, before the climate march, getting ready for 200,000 of one's closest friends to arrive for a party, and it was a little bit worrisome because it turned out to be the hottest April 29th in history, and I was, I actually, along with doing everything else everybody was doing, making sure that the porta potties were in place and so on. I was actually really worried that people were going to be sort of heat stroke and that kind of thing, and thank God everybody made it safely through. A lot of prayers answered, and it was a good day. And I left from there and went straight to Africa, where I've been for the last 3.5 weeks or so, doing hard traveling out in remote parts of both West and East Africa. And I thought maybe I would just share for a minute just a couple of vignettes just to kind of cheer folks up. Now, I was partly there because our 350 crew and many of these places are fighting big coal-fired power plants and things, and with some success. And I was also there because I really wanted to see, and I think I'll do a little writing for the New Yorker about the very rapid spread in the last couple of years of very small-scale solar energy. We've now gotten cheap enough that it's in these very, there's 600 million people in Africa without electricity. 600 million people for whom the fossil fuel revolution that transformed the Western world for the last 200 years might as well not have happened. And so it was extraordinarily fun to be out in village after village watching people get the first power of their lives. And so I remember we'd go from village to village, and the first thing I'd do, of course, was sit down with the chief at each village and have good ceremonial exchange, which in Ghana, at least, always involves a bottle of schnapps for some reason. I do not know why, but there's some relic of colonialism that's, schnapps had come to. But I was in a town in Ghana, in a very remote part of Ghana, and the chief brought around immediately to me. If you've traveled in West Africa, you know that water often appears in a kind of plastic bag. That's the kind of ubiquitous, instead of a water bottle or something like that. And you just kind of bite off the corner of the bag and suck down the water, and it's great. But it took me a second to realize why this was so important, that he was almost ceremoniously offering this. It's because it was cold. And they, for the first time, the week before, had power, and hence for the first time in history, in this place where it's 92 degrees every day because it's 6 degrees north of the equator, they had cold water to our cold. That cold was a thing, was a sort of an idea that had never really crossed my mind before, and that was powerful. And then a week later, in an even more remote part of Ivory Coast, in a village where they had their first electricity, and there was one guy in the village had a 19-inch flat screen TV now, and he'd bring it out every day, every evening for everybody to watch, everybody gather around. And I asked, what were you watching? What's everybody want to watch? Well, first the answer is soccer, and the village in the middle of nowhere is equally divided between Manchester United and Liverpool fans. Okay? But then he said the other thing we like to watch is the National Geographic Channel. And I thought about that for a minute. This is an institution, the National Geographic, that made its fortune showing Westerners pictures of remote African villages, and now, I mean, there was something powerful and beautiful in this, turning. No, in Tanzania, in East Africa last week, and, the place I was maybe 40 miles from Olduvai Gorge, where the Leakeys insisted that, human beings first emerged, But these places, no one had ever had, the most light that there'd ever been was from kerosene lamp, and that's not very much light. And you're on these, crowded, bustling roads after dark, and there is no light. We got to the house of this man, very proud to show his small solar panel and the 3 or 4 lights that it supported, including one outside the front door, a kind of security light. I said, "Are you worried about crime?" He said, "Well, we have some crime here, but what we're really worried about is the snakes. And it's really good for my children to have a light outside. Light is a good thing," he said. And light is a good thing. And we're grateful to y'all for bringing that light over and over and over again. So what a privilege to get to be here.
So let's rewind a minute to origin stories, because I think that, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, he said, into every life a call comes, but people don't always hear it. And if they hear it, they don't always answer it. And here I'm standing with 2 people who are being honored for both hearing and answering the call. And I want to ask, can you tell us that story? Can you say how you heard it and what caused you, what precipitated the entry into a life of working for love and justice? And if either of you would like to go first, that would be great.
Well, please, I started last time.
Well, I must say it's quite intimidating to be here amongst all these theologians and bishops and all of that. I not only began as a Sunday school teacher, that's exactly how high in the ecclesial hierarchy I ever rose. And in remote, I live out in the woods in the kind of Methodist church where the only qualification for being a Sunday school teacher was on Christmas Eve, could you take a tea towel and convert a 4th grader into a Palestinian shepherd? And if you could, then you'd pass the only test that mattered. I spent many years, I was a writer, and I wrote the first book about climate change. It's almost 30 years ago now, when I was in my mid-20s. And so for a long time, I thought that we were engaged in an argument about climate change, and being a writer, that the job was to write more books and have more symposiums and have more papers and give more talks, and eventually this sort of weight of evidence and reason would cause our leaders to take action. And I was very stupid, really, about this. It took me 15 years of doing that to realize that we'd long since won the argument, but in fact we were losing the fight, because the fight, as fights always are, is about money and power, and it was not going to yield to more reason. I think the emotional moment that may have kind of happened to me was taking a trip off to Bangladesh to do some work. Now, Bangladesh, obviously, probably the country on earth that's going to suffer the quickest from climate change. It's low to the water it's the delta of the Brahmaputra River, where it flows into the Bay of Bengal, and there's already people losing their farms and to salt water as it rises, and it's dependent on the melting of the glaciers upwater in the Himalayas, and they're disappearing. But when I was there, their problem was not chronic, it was acute. They were having the first big outbreak of dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease that spreads like wildfire as the temperature warms. At some level, we're conducting a large mosquito ranching experiment on our planet right now, And so people were people were very freaked out by it, and I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito, and I was as sick as I'd ever been, but of course I didn't die. I was strong and healthy and well-fed going in. But lots of people did die, and I remember going to the clinic. Not that there's anything you can really do about dengue fever. There's no prevention or really treatment because only poor people have ever gotten it, so why would you really bother to take it on, in any big way? I remember going to the clinic, which was bigger room than this, and just people on cots just shivering because it's a horrible tropical fever things, and looking out at them and thinking, damn, this is so unfair. There's 180 million people in Bangladesh, but when you try to account for when the UN tries to account for the carbon emissions of various countries on Earth, it's a rounding error. You can't even really get a number. I mean, they use so little in the way of fossil fuel. And yet the perfect inverse relationship holds that the, less of this trouble you cause, the more quickly you get it in the neck, And I just remember coming home and thinking, well, time to do something anyway. Not that I had any idea how to do anything. I'm not activist in the kind of, we just completely making it up as we went along when we started 350.org. And, but it just felt like the time had come to do something.
So my journey actually in all this work begins not too far from here. In the early part of the 70s, when I was still a child, my mother was the executive secretary, or what we would now consider executive director of East Mount Airy Neighbors, Dwayne Royster, during part of the 70s. And it was at a time when E-Man was very active. There are actually, in my parents' house, there are newspaper clippings of actions that we were doing about things that were going on in the neighborhood. It was a lot of work, and it was really my introduction to really multiracial organizing in a big way. And she did that job for several years into the early 80s, and then went back to school. And so she left that position, but it was kind of in my, I think kind of in my DNA, to sort of be a fighter for the underdog. At the same time that was happening, my grandmother used to drag us to church. Because my parents were like not really into the church thing, but my grandmother was a member of Zion Baptist Church, where Leon Sullivan was the pastor. And in that place, I learned about Black empowerment and Black self-reliance and Black engagement in the world. When I was in college, I went to a little-known Jesuit school by the name of Boston College. And while I was there, it was right after Doug Flutie left, I went to BC. So I missed all the good football games. Well, it was actually while I was at Boston that I first understood that I was really supposed to commit my life to doing this work and committing my life both to ministry. But for a lot of folk, ministry is preaching and pastoral care and, doing all the ritual stuff. But from my mind and for what I had seen as a child, you went into ministry because you wanted to do justice. And so for me, that was the part of the reason I got into ministry. I love pastoring. I love, doing all the rituals of the Christian faith and things that are important to us. But the most powerful ritual that we could ever do was to be in the streets with folk, fighting battles, fighting for all God's people. I would say that most of my work over the years and have felt particularly called to has been race and economics. And I have done tremendous amount of work around that. But the call to creation harkens probably to the deepest sense of my faith identity. Because in reality, this actually goes back to our dinner conversation from Genesis, in the early part of Genesis, where God called the first humans as we understand in that story. It's a story. It's telling us of how, giving us a reason to understand how the world came into being. That humanity was to be a steward of the earth. Some people have interpreted it as dominion. But as a result of interpreting in dominion, we got the mess we have right now. Stewardship implies partnership, even with that which you are stewarding. And so for me, in this moment, it is a call to come to an understanding of stewardship of all creation. But then it is also, in this moment, a call to be agent of helping to make intersections between all the fights that we have at this moment. So whether you're black or indigenous, or whether you're a person from South America or an undocumented immigrant who's worried about deportation and detention, or whether we're fighting the black snake in North Dakota, or whether we are battling for our LGBTQIA brothers and sisters right now, or whether we are battling the economic policies, to understand that the fight is all the same. And we are fighting an evil that is sinister, that has manifested itself in the systems of this world that are intent on destroying everyone but a handful of people. And so that is absolutely imperative that all of us line up on the same side and fight these fights with one another to what we are calling, actually in the PICO network, having a moral vision for the way the world is supposed to be, the beloved community that it's supposed to be, but then also having the political muscle to bring it to pass. And so really that's the work that we're doing, and that's the call that I'm sensing in this moment in its deepest and broadest sense, but also making sure that those who have been marginalized and dispossessed and oppressed, some of the very people you're talking about in Africa and Bangladesh and other places of the world, and the folks that are in the North Phillies and in Lower Germantown and in West Philly and in Southwest Philly and in Kensington and Fishtown, who have experienced great suffering, that they find justice. And that our children can breathe clean air and not have asthma. Right, that we are able to do those kinds of things, that we can democratize energy by putting solar panels on top of houses in Philadelphia so that people have energy year round and don't have to worry about being cut off, and maybe in the process they make a little money at the same time. If we can do all those things, man, couldn't we transform the world? Couldn't we change it? So that's what I feel part of my calling and what's got me in this moment.
Thank you. So I want to ask a follow-up question on that, because I think that the realization is dawning that environmental justice is economic justice, racial justice is cultural justice, economic justice is gender justice, and around and around and around the circle. But actualizing that is a challenge for a lot of people, because the stories that stand between us haven't been acknowledged. The histories that stand between us haven't been healed somehow. And to get together to heal the entire planet and the climate, which is, after all, the modest objective that you guys stand for, and many people in this room, I'm wondering, if you're asking people here tonight, what are some of the steps, the concrete steps that you would like to see people take to move to that point of intersectionality that you were talking about, Dwayne? And I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Sure. One of the lessons that I'm learning in this moment is that if we really want liberation for all, then in the movement for justice, we must privilege the voice of the most marginalized. And in many respects, I think we have not done that. And when I think about the voices that must be heard are the voices of our children, who are suffering greatly because of the decisions of adults, the voices of women, and in particular women of color, who are bearing the burden of a lot of the struggle of what's going on in this world, both economically and both environmentally and both, this through vast liberation, and privileging the voice of those who exist outside a heteronormative frame, to make sure that their voices are heard. Because if we focus in on liberating and helping those to experience freedom who are most marginalized, everybody else will be set free at the same time. And I think that has often been the struggle. This moment, and I've said this, I've actually, being in DC, and I sit at some tables with folk from 350 at the national level and other organizations. And it's actually interesting sitting in some of these rooms, and people are thinking and they're doing all this stuff. And I'm always quick to ask the question, we have talked about the people that are suffering the deepest, about what we want to do for them. And I'm always quick to ask the question, did anybody ask them what they want? And if we're not asking the folk who are suffering the deepest the question, then what we often wind up getting is a bunch of intellectual ideas about what the ideal situation is for people who suffer the deepest. And, from our work with power, we believe the best policymakers are the people that suffer the deepest. They can tell you what's going to help set them free. They know exactly what they need, not necessarily those folk that are sitting on the outside. So I think part of what has to happen in this moment is that we've got to enter into some real honest relationships with one another. Organizations have to sit down. We need to have the gender conversation. We need to have the orientation conversation. We need to have the race conversation. We need to have the socioeconomic conversation. We need to have a conversation about implicit bias and how it exists in our society, both through race and gender and orientation and socioeconomics. All of these things, we need to have some real honest conversations. And then when we're finally able to get honest with each other, and then we make sure that those that are sitting at the table, because I love our progressive folk, but sometimes we have a tendency to take on the framework of the dominant society, to make sure that the folk that aren't at the table are sitting at the table. Not just that they're being impacted by the work, but they're actually sitting at the table with everybody else, helping to make the plans and make the decisions about how we're going to change the damn world, if I could say it like that.
I think that's just right. And I would add, since I've spent my life living in rural communities in this country, and especially some of the sort of really poor rural communities of the Northeast, that's another set of people who never get heard in our society. As you were talking, I was thinking about, we've done these two big climate marches, one in New York 3 years ago and one just recently in DC. And my job each time, I've made it clear I'm not going to talk or my job is to go down in the morning and explain to the senators and movie stars and people who show up why they're not actually marching at the very front of the parade. It's always been, indigenous communities and frontline communities, the first 30, 40 blocks of people. And it's actually, I kind of enjoy it now, sort of explaining to, it's okay that you're not at the front, it'll be fine, and the cameras will find you eventually, and just don't sweat it. And but we need a lot more of that. The pleasure at 350 has been for us that from the very beginning it was entirely sort of open source movement, because we were 7 young people and myself sort of trying to figure out how to organize the whole planet, and that meant that there was no way it just had to be. So for me, the operative metaphor, because I'm a Methodist, it was the potluck supper. At least out in the country, the potluck supper is kind of the Methodist sacrament, and that became our motif. Like, here's the date, and here's the sort of general idea, and now you bring what you can, and that's how it worked. The last thing we wanted to have was an organization. We wanted to have a kind of network that could bring everybody, could bring their, and it works. It turns out that indeed everybody, every place knows what they need. They know how to talk to people around them in the most powerful way, and they love doing things together. The first day that in 2009, I guess, we had our first big global day of action, and we just asked everybody all around the world it was going to be on a Saturday, and we got the sense it might actually going to work 2 days early. It was Thursday, and the phone rang, and it was our leader in Ethiopia, who, like all of us, volunteer, like most of us, a she, and like a surprising number of us, 17 years old. And she was on the phone, and she was in tears, and she said, the government has taken away our permit for Saturday, so we're going to do this today before they can stop us. And that was brave, but that wasn't why she was in tears. She kept saying, we want to do this the same day as everybody else. We wanted to be part of the whole thing. We're sorry to spoil it. We don't want to jump the gun, and we're so sorry. And we have right now 15,000 young people out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. So I was like, well, don't worry about the date. It's okay. You've done good. And then over the next 48 hours, there were 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. And we didn't organize it, there were so many people willing to work. It was great. And that's why I really like doing what I get to do. In terms of concrete steps to take, tomorrow at noon at City Hall, is that City Hall at noon? There you are. And outside, not your Pico, but the other Pico,
Yeah,
the PECO. There's going to be troublemaking going on. So troublemaking is the name of the game, and so we will see you there, shine or rain. Yes, okay. Yes, how many people will be there tomorrow? There you go. Well, we've got a good demonstration right there. Fantastic.
Thank you. I am hearing from our esteemed timekeeper that this part of the conversation should come to a close. So let us again offer our blessings and give our applause to Bill McKibben and Bishop Dwayne Royster.